Good morning. Over the years I've done many funerals and sat with people in some of the dark and difficult moments of life. Not just in funerals but in other parts of life. Sharing life and death and the struggles and challenges. And I've met some amazing people, resilient, people of grace and compassion, people who rise up through the suffering and the struggles and challenges of life and grow through them and demonstrate a wisdom of life that's rich and deep. And sometimes it comes from the least expected places, not the places our society assumes are where the wisdom and truth and whatever comes from. For example, many years ago there was a funeral I did for a fellow called Graham. I never knew Graham, I knew him only in death. And I sat in his house, a single man, the funeral being arranged by his siblings. His house was fairly simple, a bit chaotic and stuff all over the place. Lived in, worn and a bit ragged. And as I sat and listened to the stories of Graham, his family, brothers and sisters, they shared stories of love and grace and obviously cared for him, but he confused them. They didn't know what to make of Graham. He frustrated them. They shared stories of him giving money away and describing him really as a soft touch. Anyone could go to Graham with a sob story and he'd hand over money. "Oh, Graham, can you lend me a few dollars? I'll pay you back." And he knew he'd never get it back, but he'd give it to them. He'd meet some people down the street and talk and discover they didn't have anywhere to stay at the moment, so he'd invite them home, "Stay with me." People who would eat his food and he'd have to go and get more. And then I asked, "Why are you giving your food away?" "Well, they must have been hungry." They shared stories. He wasn't very educated. His education was interrupted, I think with ill health. And he worked hard. He had some simple jobs and worked hard all his life. But he never saved a lot of money. He gave it away. And he enjoyed giving it away. And the stories they told were of, people would always gather around, and he knew all these people, particularly simple people and people who were struggling, and he was always generous and caring and compassionate. And his brothers and sisters couldn't understand why you give so much away, why you don't look after yourself, spend more on yourself. He would wear a coat and a tie, but instead of buying a new one when these kind of got worn and frayed, he'd care for other people and keep wearing that same old coat. He was a bit of an enigma to his family, who had other expectations of life, of getting ahead, of what it meant to have money and status and other things. But in listening to the stories and in meeting some of his friends at the funeral, I think Graham was happy. Graham was content. Graham found what life was about. And I suspect, struggling as he did as a kid, he understood other people, particularly those who were struggling and challenged, and did what he could to make a difference. And he made a difference in the world. There's another guy I remember, Jim, Gentleman Jim we called him. He lived in the church's facility for homeless men. He lived with schizophrenia. Mostly it was mild, but sometimes it flared up and it was harder. Jim always got dressed up, particularly for church. And he was friendly. He would talk to anyone, and he was generous. He didn't have much of anything, but what he did, he would share. Particularly with those homeless of Parramatta that he knew and knew well. And as I look at people like Graham and Jim and other people, I see something of the way of Jesus, and I'm inspired and learn. And it's not just them, it's people like, Malala, who spoke out for education for women, girls, in her homeland, Afghanistan, and was shot, but made a stand. And others who stand up for what is true and right and struggle for it. This week in Mark's story of Jesus, we read about him going home. He's built up this reputation for himself of one who speaks of this reign of God and lives it out in his actions and his words. He teaches and people listen to every word, but they know it's deep because they see him reaching out and offering healing and life and love to people, all sorts of people, including all sorts of people, the lowly and outcasts and marginalised and anyone else. And so in this story he goes home to his hometown. Mark doesn't name it. It's a bit of I guess he's looking down a bit on Nazareth, but Jesus goes there and into the synagogue and he stands up to teach. And at first the people, they know something of this reputation of this rabbi who's doing great things. And they say, where does he get this wisdom from? Wow, I haven't heard this before. Wow, it's first there's curiosity and wonder. And then someone recognises him and calls out, hey, isn't that the tectone? Translated often as carpenter, but carpenter is much grander than that word implies. A tectone was really down on the bottom of the social order, below peasant farmers. It wasn't a great, glorious career. He was very lowly. He was a tectone. Isn't that the tectone? Mary's son? And calling him Mary's son was probably equally a put down. You normally referred to people through their father's heritage. You would refer to Mary's son as someone who had questionable parentage. It seems like it was a put down. Who is this guy? Who is this good for nothing guy? This guy who is down the pecking order, whose parentage and family are questionable. Who does he think he is? Coming in here and telling us what is he's trying to talk about? Change the status quo, the world we know? Who is he? And they wouldn't listen. They ridiculed him. And Jesus says, a prophet's welcome anywhere except in his hometown. And he goes on, he can't do anything there. He can't share this life, this love, this grace, this healing, this wonder. They won't have it. And so the story continues and he moves on to other places. And then he sends his disciples out in pairs, out to go and share this good news. Not just in words, but in their actions, to bring healing and life to people. And he says, as you go, don't take anything with you except the sandals you need to walk and a staff for the journey. Don't take extra food or money. Go and offer what you have and receive back what others will give to you in return. If you go into a town or a home or a place and you're rejected, they won't have you. Wipe the sand, the dust off your shoes, your feet, as a witness against them and walk on. Move on to the next place at will. And the disciples do this. They go out with nothing. And it's about trusting in spirit and trusting in generosity and hospitality in return for what they have to offer. It's to go not relying on their own strength or their own resources, but to share with others and find life together. And I think that's the way of Jesus, and certainly what I hear in Jim and Graham's stories. And the disciples go, and they come back filled with wonder and stories of healing, of life, of grace, of interactions, and of people receiving them and them offering what they have. This, for me, is a challenging story of Jesus' way. Sometimes in our world, or often in our world, wisdom and truth, and we expect to hear that from the authorities, from the people who have status, people who have education or qualifications or the pieces of paper, people who are powerful or wealthy or mighty, people that we turn to for the truth. The people who on the news are asked for their opinion. And often we miss it. We miss it in those who have lived life in the dark places. The little people, the people who experience life in its fullness, who struggle with life and learn the lessons, who have the wisdom of living, and often the humility to turn to God and other people for help, who start with nothing and recognise the beauty in sharing, in generosity, who give themselves away in love and compassion and receive that in return, who build community of all sorts of people, and who don't judge people because they don't work or can't work or aren't educated or are lowly or don't have much, but welcome everyone into their sphere of friends and community and live with love. That's what Jesus calls us to. And I think in our world, if we can find this way of love, of inclusive community, of recognising that there's wisdom in all people, and all people have the gifts and skills and experience of life to share. In our nation, the Indigenous people, whose traditions and wisdom go back for centuries, have much to teach us. Much to teach us in a world of climate crisis, environmental degradation. Much to teach us in the way of spirituality and life and community and relationship, if we'll listen. The young people of today who live with the burden of climate change and the crises of the world. Those who are refugees and have travelled far distances to find safety for their families, who have endured the harshness of life and are resilient but need grace and help and have much to offer, can teach us much. The homeless in our streets, the poor, the uneducated, those who live with mental illness, the little ones, the ones in whom we see revealed this wisdom and way of God, who share and care and love. God's wisdom and love comes often in the least expected places. And it calls us out of our comfort zones to live into a new way of life and relationship and love. Will you follow in this way of Jesus? Trusting in spirit, trusting not in what you have or can do or your credentials or anything else, but trusting in the wisdom of God, the love of God and the Spirit.